So yeah, as I mentioned, and as other people may have mentioned, obviously I'm not Pastor Isaiah. Hopefully that much is clear. And so, as I mentioned, this text was chosen by him, and I had a little bit of trouble as I was reflecting on this text because I feel that this is a passage of Matthew that a lot of people really don't like. If you're familiar or have read much of the Gospel of Matthew, I think a lot of people get maybe a little bit bristly when they read Jesus ask, "Why are you afraid?" Raise your hand if, as Jesus says to them, as they're about to capsize, "Why are you afraid?" You think, what the heck is Jesus doing? Or just a little bit uncomfortable with this passage from Matthew, right? And so I think because this text is often misused to shame a lack of faith in people, or maybe to unhealthily encourage people to not care much of the storm around them and to just blindly feel comfortable with the big storms in their lives, or to dismiss our big feelings in our lives. Maybe this passage in Matthew, it has been or still is very difficult for some of us. But I want to take it in maybe a little bit of a different direction than just trying to blindly force a strong sense of faith into you all, because that is not healthy, right? And so instead, I want to begin this morning as you're in a series on questions, and as we're in a series considering Jesus's questions, a question for you all. When is the last time that you shared intimately in the joy of someone who was very different from you? So not just like kind of different, like, oh, like my daughter or son is a different generation, and so we're a little bit different, or a grandchild. But someone who was so different from you, perhaps someone you did not even know that well at all. Someone who has a completely different experience of the world around us from the one that you are having on a daily basis. So I'll repeat the question again, and this is a genuine question, not a rhetorical question that just is me leading you to an answer, but a real question for you to consider this morning. When is the last time that you shared intimately in the joy of someone who was completely different from you? So we'll come back to that question a little bit later. But first, I want to zoom in on a couple different things within the text that hopefully will get us out of the place of that perhaps shaming about people not being strong enough or trusting enough in their faith, that are interesting about this text. So, of course, I started by naming, of course, this text, like many texts, is used incorrectly to make people feel that they are not going to church enough, or they're not trusting God enough, or they're not happy with their faith in God enough, right? And so I want to name that that's been used. And if something comes up for you today in which this is still hard for you to hear, that's okay. There is no shame in having a complicated relationship to Scripture. But I hope that what we'll talk about this morning offers something different. So let's just dive in. So the first point I want to make is about the limits of language. So part of the goal of pastoral training, right, is that we have to learn about Greek and read Greek so that you all don't have to. So we did it so that you don't have to, and trust me, you should not necessarily ever have to. But if you're interested to, that's pretty easy to find online. And I want to point some specific things about the Greek out that you can explore later if you're the kind of person who really loves to dig into that kind of stuff. But what Jesus is actually saying in this text, even though the CEB version, which I did choose, but the one beef I really have about CEB is that it modernizes it a little bit too much to the point where some of the language it uses is a little bit loaded for us. So it uses the word weak faith in English, but the Greek actually talks about the people as little faiths. But the people are actually nouns, right? They are little faiths, little faiths. That they are not weak or that they're not bad. But Jesus maybe is more making an observational statement that you are little faiths. Perhaps that you haven't grown or developed in a certain way yet, that maybe Jesus is observing my goal now in our relationship is to grow this faith. Jesus is not actually saying any words that have value judgments. In English, the word weak has a really particular value judgment, right? Weak says that there's something wrong with you. But to just be called a little faith, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just an observation. So that's the first one, is that there's a little bit of a difference in that language here. And that actually the Greek that's used for little here not only just means little or small in stature or size, but it can also mean in time period. It can also mean actually that he's saying that your faith comes in seasons. Has anyone here ever really felt like your faith kind of waxes and wanes in the seasons of your life? That there are moments in your life where your faith feels very salient, and then other times when it's just not something you're thinking about. It's not something that you are rejecting, but it's just you're very busy, you've got a lot going on, it's just not something that's center. And so what does it mean for us if we think about this word as perhaps Jesus making an observation as he's being woken up in this moment, that their faith kind of seems to be situational, or their faith maybe is still experiencing seasons. More of an observation, less of a judgment of something being weak. And also the term that Jesus is using for fear or fearful is also a word that actually can mean fear-driven. It does not just mean what do you fear, as in, well, Jesus didn't really necessarily wake up in the middle of a storm as the boat is about to capsize and really genuinely wonder why the people were literally afraid. I feel pretty sure that Jesus knows why people are afraid to capsize and die. I think Jesus, again, might be speaking more as an observation of why is it in fear-driven moments people call on me the most? Is it possible that Jesus is not necessarily trying to chastise the disciples, but Jesus might be talking out loud to himself? We actually don't know that. It says that he says this to the disciples, but when you're in a room, you're kind of talking to yourself, right? And then someone says, wait, what did you say? And you're like, oh, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to myself. So how does this text change for us from the shaming that we might have received about our faith not being good enough to Jesus making observations about the human condition that are true? We have to admit, right? They are true. But Jesus is not saying that that condition is wrong, or that you are bad, or that you don't love him enough. Jesus is making simply an observation about the way that our human condition helps us or not helps us or hinders us, I guess is the opposite of help, right? Hinders us from a positive relationship with Jesus, or faith, or trust. And so what does it mean for us maybe if the word fear is actually about being fear-driven? So the other thing I want to point out is that the disciples in this chunk of Matthew don't actually do anything that we would define as like a not a faithful action. There's actually a ton of faith in waking up Jesus in the middle of the storm and saying, Jesus, please help us, we're going to drown. Because that actually shows that the disciples have faith that waking up Jesus would matter. If they didn't have faith that Jesus could do something about the capsizing and about the storm, they would not wake Jesus up. If you didn't have faith that this man of his own could help you in the middle of a storm, you'd be like, well, just let him sleep because we're all going down with the ship. They're actually incredibly faithful in waking Jesus up. So I don't think Jesus is trying to chastise them for waking him up, right? They also, at the beginning of the story, it says that they follow him onto the boat. They don't stand there and argue about whether or not it's a good idea to get on the boat with Jesus. They get on the boat. We don't have a long dialogue where Jesus has to go back and forth with them about whether or not they really want to go across the Sea of Galilee. They just get on the boat. So the interesting thing is that even though this text might sometimes be used to illustrate why we should have more faith in Jesus and that, oh, somehow the disciples didn't have enough faith until Jesus calmed the storm, they actually did have faith before the storm. They had faith during the storm. But Jesus is asking a question not about the presence or lack of faith. I think Jesus is asking a question about the human condition of the waxing and waning, or what drives our faith. Because what drives our faith does actually really matter, because it lends itself to the sustainability of our faith. So again, Jesus is not scolding them. I think Jesus is really inquiring of them, right? So think in your own mind, in your relationship to this text from Matthew, how might it change the question for you if we see that Jesus is moving from a position, if we move in our brains, Jesus from a position of judgment to a position of curiosity? And that Jesus might be holding up a mirror to the truth of our human condition rather than trying to shove our nose in something, right? So I'll be the first to admit, right, that faith definitely waxes and wanes. That there are times in my life where it is a lot easier to, post about my commitment to my church and my faith and how we're moving towards justice and all of the really great things we're doing in the community because it's relevant to what's going on in the world in the moment, right? And there seems to be an urgency. That when I am experiencing my chronic illness most saliently and I am actively in pain, that I pray more than when I'm not. When my body feels fine, I don't feel the need to pray for my fine body. I'm not often, I think some people have a acute sense that it's okay to pray for the days when you're feeling great, and some people do wake up and jump for joy and say, my body can move and it feels healthy, and I pray in gratitude. But I think more often than not, most of us just wake up and say, well, this is how our body should feel, so we just get up out of bed and we go, without thought to our faith. I'll say that when I see injustice happening in the world and when I see people in real pain in my community, my faith does feel a little bit more salient than when things seem to be pretty copacetic. That when my friends and family are in crisis, they often ask me for prayer even though they would not identify themselves as people of faith. So there's something right about the fear moments that clearly does drive people's sense of faith. We see this in a super unhealthy way in conservative evangelical churches that are slamming people over the head with fear to drive their faith. But we also see this in spaces that might be considered more progressive, where often it is in the moments of fear that we are driven to action. It's not often when things are going well that we're driven to try to suddenly figure out what's going on with communities of color around us and how they might need our relationship and support and how we can be with them. Sometimes it is only when our city is burning because a man was shot by police that suddenly we realize maybe it is time to have a relationship with communities of color in our neighborhoods. That, admittedly, the churches that I've worked at will admit, yes, that is when we realized that was important. So there are times, of course, when we are also driven to technically good things, but we are driven, we have to admit, by a sense of fear. But I think here Jesus is asking, what do you fear? Not in the literal immediate sense, but why is it that you are driven by what you fear? So for example, of course, I was just talking about race, and I think I've worked in a lot of spaces where anti-racism is an immediate endeavor, of course. I think that's a really important endeavor. A lot of communities, organizations, nonprofits, companies, churches are all taking on now, right? But often that endeavor, unfortunately, is driven by fear. We can couch it in an idea that, we want everything to be welcome for everyone. That is an important positive part of the desire to work on the matter of anti-racism. But deep down, I think in some senses, I've worked definitely in places and I've observed this, that there's also a fear of being labeled racist. There is a fear of being a bad company or a bad organization or a bad person, right? Or if you're kind of past that sense of fear, because I think some people have been able to work past that fear of being bad or being canceled or being seen as racist, that there's also maybe a fear that communities won't get to experience the same kind of happiness you're experiencing, or equality that you're experiencing, or joy that you experience until you, as an organization, or as a company, or as a church, or as a person, give somehow anti-racist something experience to communities of color, right? There might be a fear that people won't get to experience the greatness of something until you give it to them through your own work, right? And so there is sometimes fear that drives this, or maybe it's your witnessing of fear. And so sometimes I wonder, is there an intimate knowledge of love and of joy that is missing from being paired with some of our urgency that comes out of either witnessing fear or experiencing fear, that starts to lose where Jesus was trying to take us with love and justice and kindness and mercy, right? Are there ways that without experiencing the joy and abundance and flourishing and resilience of people who are on the margins, or who are different from us, that we end up falling back into a fear? I think anti-racism or any kind of justice work in a Christian space ought to be driven, right, by the very fact we do indeed trust that God indeed called all of creation very good, rather than an existential fear that the other side, that the other is coming for us politically, or is going to destroy maybe what we see as a moral foundation of something. That fear is still relevant. That fear is still valid. Of course, that we don't want our churches taken over by people who do not value the lives of our neighbors, or we do not want companies to be dumping millions of gallons of toxic waste. That fear is relevant. And I think that's important, that Jesus never is shaming the fear, the actual literal, like, wow, like this could actually impact me in a very visceral way. That's okay. And I think is wondering, can we be moved by this trust and knowledge of dignity and love that is central to what Jesus is doing in the world? And so in 2020, when we saw Minneapolis burning, as we saw people's anger put on display on the news every night, if somebody tried to shake Jesus awake and say, Jesus, our city is burning, Jesus, people in our city are dying, and if Jesus woke up and turned to you and said, what do you fear? Why are you afraid? Or why are you driven by fear? What would that mean in that case? Perhaps it would be Jesus asking, why in this moment, as this gas station explodes and burns down, are you suddenly aware of or wanting to have the dignity of your neighbor? Why, as everything, the pain of our city is put on national display on every major news syndicate in the nation, do you suddenly want to figure out how to be a better neighbor to these people? Not in a judgmental way saying, wow, you're so terrible, you should have always cared about this, but I think as an observation of what is it about this moment that drives us? To just help us reflect, what about this moment drives us, and how do we sustain this new knowledge into the future? So what I'm saying is not that Jesus would say, you're late to the party, but that Jesus would say, okay, we are acutely aware of the fear now of what would happen if we don't care. So where can you be driven from inside of you that is not fear? Right? And as the pandemic continued, and as we saw more racial violence, as an Asian American person, I had a lot of people who suddenly, right, became aware that I was experiencing violence, even though for my entire life I had. And so what I started to realize was how do I get people to sustain this care after? Or with Ukraine, how do we get people to sustain care when it's no longer urgent? I don't know that I have an answer, but that I think is what Jesus is asking. Not why didn't you care enough earlier? But I think Jesus is asking, how do we sustain care now as we go forward? So I want us to continue to think about that as we move through the rest of this. Is there something in your life that you're wondering, how do I sustain my faith that God is moving there in that place? How do I sustain the knowledge that Jesus moves for justice in that area? How do I not let my care and my sense of urgency wax and wane about the communities that I'm part of? And so the other thing I do want to say is great news about this text is that Jesus does not wait for an answer to rescue the disciples. Jesus doesn't stand there and go, okay, so what do you fear? Like, why are you so fear-driven? Give me your existential reflection right now on every thought. Like, I want to have a deep discussion right here on this boat while we wait for the storm to pass. Jesus doesn't wait for an answer. Jesus asks the question, asks them to reflect, and then immediately calms the storms. And it is the storms that Jesus gives orders to, and it is the storm that Jesus castigates or shames, I guess shames, but yells at, right, or gives orders to. It is not the disciples. Jesus doesn't say, here's how you be a better disciple, and you gotta do all these things, and suddenly I don't think you have enough faith. Jesus does not shame them. Jesus stops the storm. And he does not wait for the answer, because I think Jesus knows it's gonna take a lot longer to get that answer than they have in the moment. And so I think Jesus is leaving us to wonder after the calm, when the fear is not gripping our hearts in the moment, making us beat like 200 beats a minute, worried that we're going to fall over the side of a boat. He is leaving us to ponder what might drive us to faith that would sustain our hunger for God's people experiencing justice. What might sustain or inspire our sharing of God's love for all in our community if it's not going to be fear that all the other messages are going to hurt people, or fear of violence, or fear of the presence of things we don't agree with? What can drive it? And so I return to that initial question quickly. When is the last time you shared intimately in the joy of someone completely different than you? And might we be moved by a deep abiding love? Might we be moved by intimate knowledge of that joy? Might we be moved by the joy in communities different than ours because we believe inherently that because we trust and have faith in God, that human dignity is offered to them? Might it be about relationship and not just about going in and giving something and leaving? Might it be about standing and bridging gaps because we are driven inherently by a desire for peace and not just of a fear of violence? Might it be that the change that our world needs lay in celebrating the vulnerable moments of joy and flourishing with those on the margins rather than solely on the fear that we feel for them or of them or around them? And so I ask one last time, when is the last time that you shared intimately in the joy of someone completely different than you? Obviously, I never answered the big question of how do we find faith that isn't just driven in that fear, because I think it is a journey for each of us to take. There will be something different for each of you that drives you to faith or to think about faith more often in your life that isn't in fear than the person sitting next to you. And so I don't think there is any answer that I could give you, that Pastor Isaiah could give you, that your favorite Christian blogger, writer could give you. I think it is a journey for each of us to reflect on what drives us from deep in our soul to be connected to the souls of others that is not fear. So this morning I leave with you, at least, and insofar as much as I know, the good news that you do not have to feel shame if you do not know the answer yet. We just ask that you be on a journey with us, right? To try and figure out what that is for you. Amen.